This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, October 5th, 1982, Johnson & Johnson, Tylenol's parent company, recalls all Tylenol capsules in the United States. This was the first mass recall in U.S. history involving more than 31 million bottles, costing the company an estimated $100 million. This was all in response to a bizarre and pretty terrifying set of incidents in which 7 people that fall in the Chicago area had ingested cyanide pills, which had been inserted into Tylenol bottles that were then put back on grocery store shelves. People bought them, people took them thinking they were taking medicine, and in fact were being poisoned. No surprise, this set off a major panic, a police investigation, a huge hunt for who was responsible. And then there's this cryptic ransom letter sent to Tylenol from someone claiming to be the person behind these poisonings. So let's talk about the 1982 Tylenol panic, what we know and still don't know about who did this and why, and then these larger questions about food safety, corporate responsibility, corporate crisis management, and Tylenol's response in all of this. Let's dive in. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
All this was a little early for us, right? None of us have memories of this, but I feel like I have memories of this because part of this story is just how it fits into this moment of panic and fear, real and not, that sort of pervaded childhood in the 1980s and into the 90s.
Yes.
So I kind of feel like I lived with this, even though I never actually lived with this.
We lived with it on Halloween every year.
Yeah,
exactly.
oh gosh.
Yeah, part of this.
Halloween. Half your candy's thrown away.
Yeah, we'll get to that part of the story, right? But places canceling Halloween as part of the fallout. So let's do the details as best we know them, though. In the Chicago area, as I mentioned, people start getting sick after taking Tylenol. What else do we need to know?
I think there's an important thing to understand about this moment, and that is when you go into the store and you buy a bottle of Tylenol, there is no pre-sealed cap. There's no cotton ball. There's nothing that really separates you and the consumer other than sort of the screw top or the pop top. So it means that any sort of medicine could be very easily tampered with. And there was a level, I think, of community trust in the fact that no one thought that someone would do something so heinous. Most importantly, with medicine. And yet someone comes up with this awful plot to harm people by preying on their trust of these companies to put in the medicine that they say they're putting in.
And the 7 victims of the cyanide poisoning are just people who took Tylenol. They're all fairly young. Yeah. Only one of them is a child, Mary Kellerman, who was 12. But the rest are in their 20s and 30s. And I think that this is going to play into some of the panic and the response, is that these are just, young, healthy people who, after ingesting Tylenol, die. And so you have this rash of deaths that are happening in the Chicago area, and the response is pretty immediate. Tylenol immediately pulls everything off the shelves, but you also have on the news every night, they're saying, don't take Tylenol. You have in some places police vehicles going around with loudspeakers saying, get rid of your Tylenol. Don't ingest Tylenol. Making sure that everybody knows that there is this danger. And they don't know exactly what's happening, but they do know that if you've bought Tylenol, you need to get rid of it. If you're selling Tylenol, you need to get rid of it. And it is a pretty... As you said in the introduction, 31 million bottles are pulled to the tune of about $100 million for Tylenol. So it's a pretty... It doesn't start immediately. First they just pull the ones in the Chicago area, but pretty quickly it spreads to the entire nation.
Yeah, let's do the timeline here because, as you hinted at, Tylenol's response is generally seen as fast and fairly definitive, and as you know, we'll get to this, but you know, largely seen in kind of crisis management circles as a good response. But there are some steps along the way. So, you know, September 82 is when we have these 7 victims die in the Chicago area. The end of September 30th, the chief medical examiner in Chicago holds a news briefing, basically starts to alert the public about this. Johnson & Johnson recalls, as you said, 93,000 bottles connected to 2 of the deaths, and they are able to track where those bottles were made from in the plant, and then they expanded to 171,000. So that's like the last days of September, first couple of days of October. Well, the date we're marking today is the full recall, October 5th, right? So in those 4 days, though, right, this is a fast-breaking story. Obviously, the media's frenzy is on. In those 4 days, October 1st, we get this letter sent to Johnson & Johnson from, we eventually know, a man named James Lewis. What do we have to know about this letter?
I mean, this letter is basically a ransom letter to some extent. It's written by a man by the name of James Lewis, and he mails it to Johnson & Johnson and basically promises to kill more people if they do not wire $1 million into this account. The letter has sort of a political bent as well. He's also sort of addressing President Reagan and sort of like vowing to plant cyanide all over the country. It's at this time, too, that the mayor of Chicago, Jane Byrne, bans the sale of Tylenol in the entire city. And this really sets people off edge. Like, there is someone who is actively doing this and wants $1 million for it as well. And then the next thing you know, like a manhunt is really ensuing to figure out who this person is and what their motivations are.
And there's this sense of a city being held hostage, which I think probably is what it felt like in New York during the summer of the Son of Sam. Like that,
the Zodiac letters in the 60s in San Francisco.
Yeah. And then that the entire nation is being held hostage in a way. And that, I think, one of the reasons why the panic is so widespread is because it could be anyone, right? Like that this threat could have come into your house through a bottle of Tylenol, but now that people have the idea in their heads, it could come into your house in any way. That it is possible that there are these sort of deadly threats all around you in the most innocuous thing, in the thing that you like take to get rid of a headache, in the thing that you give your child. And that is why the panic is so widespread, because it's just kind of everywhere.
Tylenol is one of those drugs that's in everyone's medicine cabinet. You know, had this been another drug, maybe this would be a different conversation. But Tylenol seems to just have widespread use for backaches, headaches, like you said, Niki, anything, reducing fevers, anything that you can think of sort of health related. Tylenol becomes sort of that first step before you even call the doctor.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
So I want to tie up the Lewis story, this suspect, in a minute, but let's go there to this sort of larger question of what this story represented and the panic it set off, and then Tylenol's response. You know, when I read a story like this, we've done a couple stories on our show of like moral panics, right? We talked about the Dungeons and Dragons thing, and we've even talked about kind of fears over video games and music, and you know, when I read this, I kind of, that story starts to write itself in my head about the moral panic. But like, then I stop myself. I'm like, actually, no, like 7 people died. This is genuine. Like, this is a genuine attack, you know, even maybe different from, say, like the anthrax attacks in the cutting all the way forward to the 2000s. This was, you know, seemed real and willful and random. And so I can understand the level of fear, though I also then see things like the slippery slope of moral panic that comes out of this, like 40 cities across the country banning trick-or-treating at the end of the month, a month later. which just seems to me not fully connected in a sort of tangible, productive response. So it just shows how kind of moral panics, there's always an element of real fear and legitimate fear and justified fear.
Yeah, it's so easy to go to that story because it's the 80s.
Right.
And there were moral panics happening all over the place. But here, I think, in the Tylenol story, and this is a good way to segue into Tylenol's response, is there was a real weakness in the system that could be exploited by bad actors.
Yep.
And Tylenol, in thinking about their response, first of all, like, yes, it does take them kind of over the month of September and into October to issue the full recall. But when they take Tylenol off the shelves, and there's this moment where people start to speculate that Tylenol is done. No one's ever going to take Tylenol again. They're going to have to rebrand. They're going to have to name it something else because now this is connected to a tainted product. But in order to kind of rescue the brand, Tylenol comes out, as you mentioned, Jody, with a whole system of safety mechanisms and safety signaling so that when you buy a bottle of Tylenol, when it returns to the shelves, it has the cotton ball. It has the
Plastic
foil seal. It has the child safety cap. It has the plastic wrap around that. And Tylenol becomes a leader in what is going to become a way of sort of safety sealing basically everything we buy. I mean, I think we take it for granted now, but like everything,
like milk.
comes
Think
sealed
about
up.
milk.
Like milk.
Right.
Think about Motrin or any other drug for that matter. I mean, think about, I don't know, like toothpaste. Do they do that for toothpaste? Maybe they do.
It's in a box.
Yeah, I know. But like, there's always that extra layer of packaging around anything that you're going to consume. I mean, I don't even like it if I worry about someone touching something I'm about to eat, let alone putting something in it.
Right. And now, of course, we gripe about how annoying all this packaging is and so forth. But, you know,
I can't get this open.
but it is remarkable. And this is why I think this is taught in sort of crisis management circles and is often brought up as, you know, what the big lessons are. But, you know, it is remarkable how just like weeks later, the story is Tylenol is so proactive. Tylenol is a leader in this front. Their like brand awareness and brand like trust is, you know, empirically through polling and so forth and through news reporting like is increased through this, which is just kind of remarkable. And I think, you know, to draw out the lessons and the kind of specifics here, I think one is, yes, the speed with which they responded and very quickly moving to a kind of over response to some extent. You know, if they had tried to thread the needle and said, oh, we're just going to deal with this in the Chicago area, like that may have actually, you know, forestalled further deaths. But I think from a PR perspective, this big, bold step did burnish their reputation well. But I will also point out, like, it is important to realize, you know, as I think about this, the problem here was with the packaging, not the product itself. I think that matters, right? So it's not like Tylenol itself was poisoning people, right? And it was very clearly a like deranged bad actor. It wasn't like there was poisoning at the plant, right? If this story would have played out differently, if it had been like either there's poisoning at the plant that's getting into this, and so we can't trust Tylenol's system or manufacturing. You know, so I think there were just enough sort of details in here that let Tylenol find this stance and actually sort of reverse it in their favor. But yes, I mean, you know, crisis management folks point to this all the time as one of the ways to kind of move and really own an issue. And a lot of companies haven't learned that lesson, you know, over the years. But yeah.
It also makes me think about the story that we've talked about meat in the early 20th century, about the importance of being able to signal to consumers that our product is safe. And the government plays a role in that. Obviously, there's regulation around meat, but in this case, you know, Congress passes a law making tampering with consumer products a federal crime with some pretty heavy sentences, including life in prison. And there is a kind of all hands on deck response to the idea that something we consume could be dangerous to us. And here we're going to put in place all of these things in order to signal to you that it's safe. And also, in the case of both meat and Tylenol, we're going to make it safer.
Right.
And that seems to be important.
Yeah. And, you know, part of this story is also just like, if someone is going to be deranged and malicious and try and find a way to do some like truly sociopathic, awful shit, like you can't prevent
a way.
all of these. You can't. Yeah, they will find a way. But let's then come back to who may have done this. So we have this figure, James Lewis, who mails this letter to Johnson & Johnson asking for $1 million. In the end, it looks like James Lewis is not the person responsible for this. And he gets arrested on December 13th in New York City at a library in New York after a couple-month manhunt. He tells the police kind of like he does a if I did it thing where he's like, I didn't do this, but, I can see how someone would have done this, and they would have taken them off the shelves and unpackaged it in it. Like, he clearly had thought this through and felt a connection to this. Right. Yeah. It's like, James, you're not doing yourself any favors here by describing how you knew how someone would have done it. But it does seem like he was really kind of taking advantage of this moment and this publicity, in part because when he asks for $1 million to get wired, he asks the account that he gives for it to get wired to is his wife's former employer. Is that right? And basically,
it makes no sense.
It makes no sense, but I think this is the logic. He wanted, basically, his wife had been fired. He was upset about that. He wanted to embarrass or frame his wife's former employer, and he thought, I'll send this letter, put their name in it, and somehow this guy will be on the hook for this thing that's happening in the news.
People need better schemes.
But he goes to jail for 13 years for mail fraud, which I guess sending this letter. But it is pretty clear that he was in New York while this was all playing out and was probably not the person behind it. And he, from the beginning, kind of, as soon as the police show up at his door, he basically denies it, and I think fairly credibly denies it. And then there's like DNA samples later on that maybe sort of exonerate him. He died just this year, just this summer. I noticed. But what this means is that we kind of don't know who did this, right?
We still don't know who did this.
And the police, they were kind of innovative in the way that they were trying to figure out who did this. They even looked at people who might have profited off of Tylenol's collapsing stock price. What could the motive for this be? But honestly, the motive for it is probably the motive for most serial killers, right? Somebody who's sadistic and wants to harm a lot of people and generate a lot of fear. Took advantage of a weakness in the system. And I think it also speaks to how difficult it would be to track down a crime like this, especially when when people aren't imagining that this could happen. There's not necessarily a system, especially in the early 80s. Nowadays, you could probably figure it out. But in the early 80s, I think it has proven to be a real challenge.
Oh, yeah. How are you going to get fingerprints in a grocery store when people are touching everything? How are you going to there were no cameras, in stores or anything like that. So it's terrifying to think of what was so easily accomplishable back then. But it would be incredibly hard to trace.
I think it also helps us understand, because I think we, 40 years later, have perhaps lost sight of how it is that we've accrued so much of a surveillance state. Totally. And it's for things like this. It's like we want the CCTV recording of the grocery store. We want to know who bought cyanide at this point, at this moment. And so there is this this call, kind of like the society was calling out for this kind of observation, and now it's led to the constant surveillance we are all under.
Oh, now everybody's got a Ring doorbell.
Yeah,
it's who's dropping off that package? Leave it right there. It's everywhere.
That's a really good point. And you can also see then how this ties into just what I think are generally seen as moral panics of, the injecting poison into apples at Halloween, or the razor blades in the candy kind of things, which, those have been reported on that those basically are all made up. No, never really happened. Or if it did, in
a few cases in the 70s.
Exactly. But, you see how this ties in, as we were saying. All right. Well, super fascinating story. I'm glad we got to it. And I suppose we will leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
We've been receiving calls about once every 15 seconds at the Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's. We only have 3 poison lines, and they're lit up constantly ever since yesterday morning.
Right now, they're telling people which lots of Tylenol are known to have contaminated capsules and checking to see if callers have displayed any symptoms of cyanide poisoning.
Thanks for listening. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Mardovich, executive producer. Yuri Lasordo, director of operations. Thanks to all of you who support this show by being members of Radiotopia. Find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find us on social, suggest topics, all that and more at our website, thisdaypod.com. See you soon. Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple.
Radiotopia.